The cardboard sign read, "Homeless Veteran. Anything helps. God bless." For 8 months, it had been James Mitchell's daily companion, propped against his backpack on street corners throughout downtown Chicago. At 38, James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, earning a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in an IED explosion that left shrapnel in his left leg and trauma in his mind that no medal could acknowledge. The transition from military service to civilian life had been harder than any battle James had fought overseas. The structure, purpose, and brotherhood that had defined his existence for 12 years vanished the day he received his discharge papers. What remained was a VA system overwhelmed by need, a job market that didn't know how to translate his military skills, and nights filled with flashbacks that made sleep feel like enemy territory. The descent had been gradual, then sudden. First he'd stayed with his sister Maria until her husband made it clear that James's nightmares were disrupting their household. Then came a series of couches belonging to fellow veterans, each arrangement temporary and tinged with the understanding that everyone was struggling. A minimum wage job at a warehouse lasted 3 months, until James's PTSD episodes became too frequent to hide. The final blow came when his unemployment benefits ran out, and the small apartment he could barely afford became impossible to maintain. Homelessness had a particular cruelty for veterans. Men and women who had been trained to serve, to protect, to stand for something greater than themselves, reduced to holding signs and hoping for the kindness of strangers. James carried his service record in a plastic bag along with his few possessions, a reminder of who he used to be when he forgot who he was trying to become. The shelter system was a maze of regulations, waiting lists, and temporary solutions. James had spent nights in emergency shelters when the weather was dangerous, but mostly he'd chosen the relative freedom of doorways and park benches over the chaos and unpredictability of overcrowded facilities. He'd learned which restaurant dumpsters contained the safest discarded food, which public restrooms stayed unlocked after hours, and which neighborhoods allowed him to exist without harassment. But it was the invisibility that hurt most. The way people's eyes would slide past him, as if he were part of the urban landscape rather than a human being, with a story, with service, with dignity and tact, despite his circumstances. James had trained himself to say thank you and God bless you to everyone who dropped coins in his cup, even when their body language suggested they were buying absolution rather than offering genuine care. The turning point had come 6 months ago, through an encounter that still seemed impossible to James. He'd been sitting outside a Starbucks on a particularly cold February morning when a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen had stopped not just to give him money, but to ask his name and listen to his answer. "I'm James," he'd said, surprised by the question. "Nice to meet you, James. I'm Sarah. How long have you been out here?" The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and changed the trajectory of James's life. Dr. Chen ran a nonprofit organization called Second Chances that specifically served homeless veterans, providing not just housing assistance, but job training, mental health support, and most importantly, the kind of comprehensive care that recognized the complexity of veteran homelessness. "We don't just want to get you off the street," Dr. Chen had explained. "We want to help you rebuild the life you deserve to have." The program had been intensive and not always easy. James had spent 60 days in transitional housing while working with counselors on his PTSD, learning job skills that translated his military experience into civilian employment, and most challengingly, rebuilding his sense of self-worth and purpose. Now, 6 months later, James lived in a small but clean apartment and worked full-time at Second Chances, serving as a peer counselor for newly homeless veterans. His official title was Outreach Coordinator, but his real job was being living proof that recovery was possible, that homelessness wasn't a permanent condition, and that every person on the street had a story worth hearing and a life worth saving. The Family Feud opportunity had come through Second Chance's board of directors, who had nominated James for the show's special episode featuring people who had overcome significant challenges. The organization thought James's story could bring attention to veteran homelessness and the programs that were making a difference. James's first reaction had been terror. Television meant exposure, visibility, the possibility that people from his past, former military colleagues, family members who had written him off, might see him and judge the lowest point of his life. But Dr. Chen had helped him reframe the opportunity. "This isn't about your homelessness," she'd said. "This is about your recovery. This is about showing people that veterans deserve support, that homelessness can happen to anyone, and that with the right help, anyone can rebuild their life." The Second Chance's family team consisted of James, Dr. Chen, Maria, his sister, who had reconciled with him as his life stabilized, another veteran named Robert, who had gone through the program before James, and Lisa, a volunteer who had become James's mentor and close friend. They were all people who had been part of his journey from despair to hope. Maria had been especially nervous about the appearance. She still carried guilt about the period when she couldn't house James, and she worried that television might sensationalize his story in ways that felt exploitative. But James had assured her that sharing his experience was part of his healing, part of his service to other veterans who were still living on the streets. "I used to be ashamed of being homeless," James had told her. "But now I understand that my homelessness was just a chapter in my story, not the whole book. And maybe my story can help someone else write a better ending to theirs." Steve Harvey noticed James immediately during the pre-show warm-up. There was something about his bearing, the military posture that persisted despite everything he'd been through, the careful way he spoke, as if words were valuable and shouldn't be wasted, the quiet strength that suggested someone who had seen the worst of life and chosen to find meaning in it. "Anyway, James," Steve said during introductions, "tell me about Second Chances and what you do there." James straightened slightly, the way he always did when talking about his work. "Second Chances is an organization that helps homeless veterans get back on their feet," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I work as a peer counselor, which means I help guys who are going through what I went through, being on the streets, feeling like there's no way out, like they're invisible to the world." "And you went through this yourself?" Steve asked gently. James nodded. "I was homeless for 8 months. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home with PTSD, and couldn't figure out how to be a civilian. Lost my job, lost my apartment, ended up on the streets with a cardboard sign." The honesty of his admission hung in the air. Steve's expression showed respect rather than pity. "What changed for you, James? How did you get from the streets to helping other people?" "Someone saw me as human," James said simply. "Dr. Chen stopped to ask my name, to hear my story, to treat me like I mattered. That's all it took. One person who looked at me and saw potential instead of just problems." Steve nodded, clearly moved by James's dignity in sharing such a personal story. The game began against the Williams family from Detroit, and both teams proved competitive. James was thoughtful with his answers, drawing on a breadth of experience that included military service, street survival, and social work. When questions came up about overcoming challenges or helping others, his responses carried a weight that resonated throughout the studio. During commercial breaks, Steve found himself drawn to James's quiet confidence. There was something about the man's presence, the way he encouraged his teammates, the way he seemed genuinely interested in the other family's success, the way he carried himself with dignity despite having shared his most vulnerable moments, that spoke of character that had been tested and proven. It was during the 4th round that the question came that would open James's heart completely. "We surveyed 100 people," Steve announced. "Name something that saved your life." James was at the podium. The question felt like the universe asking him to distill his entire recovery journey into a single answer. He thought about Dr. Chen's kindness, about the Second Chances program, about the medication that helped with his PTSD, about the apartment that gave him shelter, about the job that gave him purpose. But what had really saved his life wasn't any single thing. It was the moment when he stopped being invisible, when someone looked at him and saw a human being worthy of care and respect. "Strangers who saw me as human," James said clearly. The words carried such profound truth, such hard-won wisdom, that the studio fell completely silent. Steve set down his cards immediately and approached James. "Strangers who saw you as human," Steve repeated softly. "James, that's powerful. Tell me what you mean by that." James took a deep breath, realizing he was about to share the most vulnerable part of his story on national television. "When you're homeless, you become invisible," James said, his voice gaining strength. "People look through you, around you, but not at you. They see a problem, a statistic, something uncomfortable that they want to avoid. But Dr. Chen stopped and asked my name. She listened to my story. She saw me as a person who had served his country, who had fallen on hard times, but who still had value, still had potential. The audience was completely quiet, hanging on every word. That moment changed everything. James continued. Not because she gave me money, though that helped, but because she gave me something more important. She gave me dignity. She reminded me that I was still human, still worthy of respect, still capable of contributing something to the world. Behind James, Maria was crying. Dr. Chen had her hand over her heart, remembering that first conversation. The entire studio was witnessing something profound. A man transforming his deepest shame into his greatest strength. Steve's eyes were filling with tears. James, I need you to understand something. What you just described isn't just about homelessness. It's about what it means to see people really see them. You're telling us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply acknowledge someone's humanity. James nodded. When you're on the streets, you realize that everyone is just one or two bad breaks away from being where you are. The difference between housed and homeless is often just about who had support when they needed it and who didn't. Steve walked closer to James, his expression intense with respect and admiration. Son, I've met a lot of people in my career, but I've never met anyone who understood dignity the way you just described it. You took the worst experience of your life and turned it into a mission to help other people. James shook his head. I didn't have a choice, Mr. Harvey. Once you've been invisible, once you know what it feels like to be written off by society, you can't walk past someone else in that situation without stopping. You can't pretend you don't see them, because you remember what it felt like when people didn't see you. Steve turned to address the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, James just taught us something that every person in America needs to hear. He taught us that homelessness can happen to anyone, even heroes who served our country. He taught us that the solution isn't just programs or money. It's recognition, it's dignity, it's seeing people as human beings instead of problems to be solved. The audience began to applaud, but Steve held up his hand. But James also taught us something else. He taught us that rock bottom can become a foundation if you use it right. He went from needing help to giving help, from being served to serving others. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card, but then he paused. James, I want to do something, Steve said. I want to make sure people know about second chances, about the work you're doing, about the veterans who are still on the streets waiting for someone to see them as human. The gesture was unprecedented, but Steve's emotion was so genuine that everyone in the studio understood they were witnessing something special. Would you be willing to come back to help us spread awareness about veteran homelessness, to help us show people that these are our heroes and they deserve our support? James could barely speak through his emotion. If it helps one veteran get off the streets, if it helps one person understand that homeless people are human beings with stories, then yes, absolutely. Steve then did something that would become one of the most meaningful moments in Family Feud history. He removed his suit jacket and approached James. This jacket has been with me through thousands of shows, Steve said. But today, it belongs to someone who's shown me what real service looks like. You served your country in Afghanistan, and now you're serving your fellow veterans at home. You wear this, and remember that your story isn't just about surviving, it's about saving others. As Steve draped his jacket over James's shoulders, the entire studio rose in spontaneous applause. But the moment that broke everyone's hearts was when James looked directly into the camera and said, to any veteran watching this who's living on the streets right now, you're not invisible, you matter. There are people who want to help you, who see your service, who understand your sacrifice. Don't give up. The episode aired 8 weeks later and became one of the most impactful Family Feud episodes in the show's history. The segment featuring James's story was viewed millions of times, but more importantly, it generated unprecedented support for veteran homelessness programs across the country. Second Chances received over $200,000 in donations within the first month after the episode aired, allowing them to expand their services and help twice as many veterans. James received thousands of messages from other veterans, from people who had experienced homelessness, and from viewers who had been inspired to volunteer or donate because of his story. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from veterans who were still homeless. James received dozens of calls and emails from people who had seen the show and reached out for help. Each contact represented a life that might be saved, a person who had been reminded that they were seen and valued. Steve Harvey kept his promise to support second chances, arranging for regular donations from his foundation and featuring James on his talk show multiple times to continue raising awareness about veteran homelessness. 6 months after the Family Feud appearance, James was promoted to program director at Second Chances. His lived experience, combined with his natural empathy and communication skills, made him uniquely qualified to oversee the organization's expansion into 3 new cities. I used to think my homelessness was the worst thing that ever happened to me, James reflected in an interview a year later. But now I understand that it was preparation for the most important work of my life. I had to experience invisibility to understand how powerful it is to truly see someone. Today, James Mitchell lives in a modest apartment filled with letters from veterans he's helped, photos from Second Chances events, and military memorabilia that reminds him of his service. But the most prominent display is Steve Harvey's jacket, hanging in a place of honor next to his Purple Heart. He still works the streets, but now he's the one stopping to ask names, to hear stories, to remind people that they're human and valuable. He carries business cards for Second Chances and a photo from his Family Feud appearance. Not as a trophy, but as proof that recovery is possible, that stories can change, that sometimes the people who have fallen the furthest are the ones best equipped to help others climb back up. Every week, James speaks at community events, sharing his story not for sympathy, but for understanding. He talks to high school students about the realities of military service and the importance of supporting veterans. He speaks to business groups about hiring people with gap histories. He addresses church congregations about seeing homeless people as neighbors rather than nuisances. Homelessness taught me something I never learned in the military. James often tells audiences, "It taught me that strength isn't about how much you can endure alone. It's about having the courage to accept help when you need it, and the wisdom to offer help when you can give it." In his office at Second Chances, James keeps a simple sign that reads, "Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone can be saved." Below it hangs a photo of him with Dr. Chen, the woman who first saw him as human, and next to that, a picture from Family Feud showing him wearing Steve's jacket. Because James had learned that the most powerful force in the world isn't military might or economic strength. It's the simple act of one human being looking at another and choosing to see dignity instead of despair, potential instead of problems, humanity instead of homelessness. And on the streets of Chicago, Detroit, and now 3 other cities, veterans who once felt invisible are being seen, heard, and helped by a man who understands that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're really made of. Sometimes heroes fall, but as James Mitchell proved, the measure of heroism isn't in never falling. It's in getting back up and then helping others do the same.